Hello, Virgo. I know why you're here. Not because of anything mystical, not because the universe sent you a memo, but because something in you has been restless. Something beneath the surface of your everyday life has been quietly insisting that there is more to a particular situation than what you have been allowing yourself to see. And that restlessness, that persistent low frequency hum of something unresolved brought you to this moment, to this reading, to these words. Oh, so I want you to do something before we go any further. I want you to lower your defenses just slightly, not completely. Keep your discernment, keep your rationality, but soften the part of you that has been working very hard to explain away what it has been sensing. Because what the energy around your situation is reflecting right now is something that may genuinely challenge the narrative you have constructed about where things stand. And I say that not to alarm you, but because you deserve to encounter it with an open enough interior that it can actually land. This is going to be hard for you to believe. Not because it is impossible, but because it contradicts something you may have decided, something you may have concluded in a quiet, private moment when the evidence seemed to point in a particular direction, and you told yourself, with the firmness of someone who has been hurt before, that you knew what was real and what wasn't. What the energy suggests is that you may not have the full picture. Let's begin with what is present in the atmosphere around you right now, because the energetic field surrounding your situation has a very specific quality that is worth naming carefully. There is tension here, but it is not the tension of something breaking. It is the tension of something that has been compressed for a long time, held under pressure in the interior world of another person, and is now reaching the kind of critical density that precedes a release. The tension of a truth that has been living in silence and is growing too large for silence to continue containing it. There is someone in the field of your life who is carrying something about you, something about how they feel, something about what you mean to them. And the reason they haven't said it, the reason it is still circulating in the unseen space between you rather than existing in the open air where you could both examine it, is not what you think. It is almost certainly not what you think, because here is what is genuinely difficult to believe and what the energy is reflecting with unusual clarity and consistency. The silence has never been indifference. The distance, when it has appeared, has never been the distance of someone moving away. It has been the distance of someone who does not yet know how to move closer without everything changing, and who is not entirely sure, in their most vulnerable interior moments, that they are safe to try. Uh, Stay with that for a moment, because it requires a particular kind of willingness to receive it accurately. We live in a world that has taught most of us to read silence as absence, to interpret distance as disinterest, to conclude, when someone does not say the thing we need to hear, that they do not feel it. And those conclusions are understandable. They are protective. They are the mind doing what the mind does when the heart has been uncertain for too long, which is to build a story that feels more stable than the ambiguity of not knowing. A story that hurts, perhaps, but at least holds a shape, at least gives you something solid to stand on while you figure out what comes next. But stories built from protection are not always built from truth. And what the energy around this situation is asking you to consider, gently but persistently, is whether the story you have been standing on is actually the ground, or whether it is something you constructed because the actual ground was too uncertain to rest on. What lives in the subconscious currents beneath the surface of this connection is something that will genuinely surprise you if you allow it to. Because when we move beneath the level of behavior, beneath the level of what has and hasn't been said, beneath the choices that have been made and the ones that haven't, what we find is not what the surface suggests. What we find is intensity, a depth of feeling that this person has not been expressing outwardly, because expressing it outwardly would require a courage that they are still quietly and privately in the process of building. There is an archetypal energy at work in this person's interior world that speaks of someone who feels everything profoundly but has learned through experiences that left their mark to contain rather than release, to observe rather than declare, to stay close to the edge of vulnerability without stepping off it, because stepping off it has, at some point in their history, resulted in something they are still in the process of recovering from. This is not a character flaw, it is a deeply human response to a deeply human kind of pain. But it means that what they carry about you has been living in the interior, growing in the quiet, becoming more certain and more complex and more undeniable with every passing day, while the surface of their behavior has told a story that does not match the interior reality at all. And here is the part that may be hardest to believe, because it requires you to hold two things at once that your mind may insist cannot both be true. This person thinks about you far more than you know. Their inner world, when it comes to you, is extraordinarily active, extraordinarily detailed, extraordinarily present. The version of you that lives in their subconscious is not a vague impression. It is specific, it is vivid, it is returned to again and again in the private hours of their life with a consistency that would astonish you if you could somehow witness it. And yet you may have been feeling on the surface of things that you are not particularly present to them at all. That the connection lacks the urgency or the expressiveness that would reflect the depth you sense or the depth you yourself carry, that perhaps you have been overestimating things, reading too much into moments that, when examined in the cold light of their behavior, do not seem to confirm what your instincts have been telling you. Your instincts have not been lying to you. That is what is hard to believe. The gap between what this person feels and what they show is not a gap that reflects the truth about their feeling. It reflects the truth about their fear. And those are entirely different things with entirely different implications. And it matters enormously which one you have been using to interpret the silence. As we move into the deeper emotional and psychological layers of this connection, something becomes very clear. This person exists in a state of genuine internal conflict when it comes to you. On one side of that conflict is the full weight of what they feel, which is considerable, which is not casual, which has been building and deepening and refusing to diminish in the way that things without real substance tend to diminish over time. On the other side is a very old, very deeply conditioned fear of what happens when you give something that important to another person. When you hand over something that precious and wait to see if it is received with the care it deserves, they are not certain you know how much you mean to them. They may even, in their most self-protective moments, suspect that you don't feel the same depth, which keeps them in that internal holding pattern, that suspended state of feeling everything and saying almost nothing, of being profoundly present on the inside while perhaps appearing frustratingly unreadable on the outside. Uh, and here is the shift. Here is what the energy suggests is beginning to move in the unseen dynamics of this connection, and why this reading feels timely rather than simply reflective. Something is loosening. Something in the interior architecture of this person's self protection is developing cracks. Not from pressure, not from damage, but from the sheer accumulated weight of what they have been carrying. There is only so long that something this substantial can be contained in silence before the silence becomes its own kind of unbearable, before the cost of not saying it begins to outweigh the risk of saying it, before the fear of vulnerability becomes less threatening than the prospect of continuing to live with this much feeling and this little expression of it. The energy around this situation suggests that something is approaching a point of release, not an explosion, not a dramatic confrontation, not some cinematic moment of declaration, something quieter than that. Something more like a door that has been stuck finally giving way, a conversation that begins as one thing and becomes another. A moment of honesty that arrives not because it was planned, but because the person carrying it finally reaches the point where continuing to carry it alone is simply no longer sustainable. You may already be feeling the early tremors of this shift without knowing what to attribute them to, a difference in the quality of their attention, a moment that felt slightly more open, slightly more unguarded than what you are used to. Something in their eyes when they thought you weren't looking, or something in the texture of an ordinary exchange that seemed to contain a weight it usually doesn't carry. These are not your imagination. These are the surface signs of something that is genuinely moving beneath. But now I want to turn toward you, because this reading is not only about someone else's interior world, and it would be doing you a disservice to leave it there. You came here carrying something too, not just curiosity, not just the idle wondering of someone with nothing at stake. You came here with your own unresolved interior, your own version of this feeling that you may have been managing, containing, protecting yourself around in ways that mirror more closely than you might realize what the other person has been doing. There is a symmetry in this connection that the energy keeps returning to two people, each carrying more than they are showing, each reading the surface of the other and drawing conclusions that don't fully account for what lives below it. Which means the most important thing this reading can offer you is not simply an understanding of what someone else is feeling. It is a gentle, honest invitation to examine your own interior with the same generosity you might extend to them, to ask yourself where you have been letting fear write the story, where you have been mistaking protection for clarity, where the conclusions you have drawn have been built more from self preservation than from an accurate reading of what is actually present in this connection. Because what is actually present, the energy suggests, is something worth not giving up on prematurely, something worth staying curious about, something worth approaching not with the armor of someone who has already decided how it ends, but with the openness of someone who is willing to be surprised. The truth about this connection may be genuinely hard for you to believe, not because it is bad, because it is better than the story you have been telling yourself. And you are allowed to let that in. You are allowed to set down the protective narrative and stand for a moment in the uncertainty of something that might actually be real, that might actually be deep, that might actually be worth every uncomfortable, vulnerable, uncertain moment it asks of you. The energy around you is not asking you to be naive. It is not asking you to abandon your discernment or override your own knowing. It is asking you to consider that your knowing may have been working with incomplete information, that the full picture, when it eventually becomes visible, may ask you to revise conclusions that felt solid but were built in the dark. Stay open, not recklessly, not without your own sense of self intact, but open enough that the truth, when it finally arrives in the open air between you and this person, can actually find you ready to receive it because it is coming. And when it does, I think it is going to change things in ways you are not quite prepared for yet, but you will be. You are already more ready than you know.